Hello, welcome everyone to this week's webinar. And the topic today is the top 10 tips for human-machine interface design. And I'm Alan Williams with Barrett Electronics. If somebody could just let me know that they can hear the audio okay, just doing the sound check. Be brave enough to say yes. Excellent. Thank you so much for that. So, hey, just about to kick off to let you know that all lines are muted, but we will be taking questions via chat during the webinar, and we will be answering them in real time as well. So if you can locate chat, it's going to be on the menu bar. And hit chat, it'll open up a window, and you can use that to type in questions as we go along. So let me introduce today's speaker. Today's speaker is Gabe Barrett. Gabe is a senior applications engineer and a training instructor here at Beijer. He has lots of experience working with Beijer customers on some of the most demanding applications, and a lot of what he's sharing with us today is really borne out through experience of working with customers on HMI design. So without further delay, let me hand over to Gabe. Over to you, Gabe.
Thanks, Alan. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Thanks. All right, let me get my screen shared. All right, folks. All right, so hopefully everyone can see my screen okay. And again, thank you, Alan, for the introduction. We're going to talk about the 10 tips for HMI design. Now, these are just tips. These aren't any specified rules that are, something that you have to follow. Now, these are guidelines and standards, but of course, you're going to be under your own project constraints. So let's get started. All right, so we're going to talk about the project, just building out the HMI, where to start. So you can see here, this first slide is identifying the end users, all right? So that's super important, obviously, super important. But the reason for that is this can change your entire structure of how your project is developed, all right? You got to identify these people first. Now, the reason why it's going to be as important as it is because that you're going to have a lot of different perspectives. You're going to need to be able to keep some people off of interacting with some objects. You're going to need to make sure somebody has access to it. And of course, we all fear about the one person that shouldn't have has access to it, to an object, and they do something to mess up the system. All right. So questions you need to ask yourself are things like, does the administrators of the plant need to be able to go in and change values? Are they trained to use and operate the machines? Or is that something that only the operator should do because you trust them to do that because they've been trained to do it? But administrators might need to be able to see those values, like reading a report as opposed to being able to create the report themselves. You have it fired off, do you let them go and grab it? Things of that nature, all right? Now, the other part of that is going to be documenting. How do you figure out who should be doing what and when and where? All right, so we already know our stakeholders. Okay, so we know that we need an operator, we need a maintenance supervisor, manager, what have you, but how do they interact with the machine? So documenting first can be crucial to your entire project development. All right, when you're developing your HMI screens. Because if you don't know where they should be interacting with, and you leave something out, something can go wrong, obviously, and then it's a slippery slope, right? So create a flow chart. What's the process that's happening with your plant, with your machine, and so on? What's happening there? Now, where does the user actually interact, where you need input from that user or values displayed? Now, documenting it first has a couple great benefits to it, such as building out training material for later. So when you actually send out your machine to be used in whatever planet it's being used, you don't have to start from scratch when you're building out that training documentation. You can isolate just the areas where you've identified of this is how you use this, as opposed to here's the whole process of the machine and what's happening into it. All right, so you can really focus on who your audience is for your documentation. All right, now the training piece of the documentation is probably one of the biggest pieces when I get projects sent over and I need to look at them, review them, or things need to be converted, because there is hardly ever any documentation on how to use the HMI, how the user interacts with the machine. All right, so that is huge. You'd be doing yourself a great service if you were to document that from the beginning. Obviously, documentation needs to be updated, it needs to be managed, and it needs to be accessible. So put it into IX Developer. You're developing your HMI. We have places like the component library that allow you to do so. All right, now, you see here from the images that we have a wastewater treatment process, just a generic schema there. And then you have, okay, this is how the user uses it, and basically just a flow of if statements, right? Now, that PDF icon there at the bottom means that we have a PDF viewer in IX Developer. Convert it to a PDF, throw it up there, and make it available. So if somebody has a question, they always have a reference to go back to. Documentation when it comes to software, anything technical, is always crucial, but always the last thing people want to deal with. Now, create a toolkit. All right, the toolkit could be a number of different things. For instance, a style guide. All right, the style guide could consist of what types of buttons you use, the formatting, the text that needs to be applied, all those things around keeping your project consistent from the home screen, the landing page, to the last maintenance page. All right, however your project's set up. Now you can keep this as something that is going to be, let's see, you can keep this as basically what you're seeing there in the green text in a separate document, or you can save it in our component library within IX Developer. Now, I'm going to mention the component library in IX Developer quite often because this is exactly what a toolkit can contain. All right, all the stuff that you're going to see here. Now, keep in mind that a style guide, you might, if you notice, it's written more like a CSS document, but it doesn't have to be. You can write out paragraphs, however you're going to do it, create with a format that's easily readable for more than just you. So somebody coming in taking over that project isn't blind looking at it being overwhelmed. All right, so you're writing it for future reference, future users, and so on. Now, another way that you can build out and add documentation to your toolkit is using screen templates. All right, so we're going to jump into IX Developer in just a second, but I'm going to show you that screen templates can be used in a variety of different ways, different types of screens and so on, that you can always use later on for future projects. This reduces the amount of redundancy. Nobody likes to repeat themselves, right? So this allows you to do so and be more efficient with your time to build out your projects faster. You can always use screens from other projects as well. All right, I'll show you how we can import those screens. And so using that as an example, we can just actually take in a full base project. So create your base project. Say you're always working on the same, you're always starting from the same point. Why recreate that same point every time? Create a base project, do a save as, and rename it. Build your project from there. All right, so I'm going to jump out of PowerPoint here and let you see this. All right, so for instance, we have our templates. So up here in the upper left-hand corner, under the Home tab, if I click on this little arrow next to Add Screens, I can see I have a number of different templates. This saves within my entire instance of IX Developer. So I can move from project to project and I'll still have all these templates available. This includes using pop-up windows. So you can use pop-up screens and it'll still save all the configurations that you had before. The position, the size, where it lands, all the actions that it's looking for that's been associated with, say, the buttons, images, and so on. That includes tag association. Now, underneath here in our Project Explorer, we can right-click this empty gray space, and we can see that we have an import. I can import from a number of different projects, different screens. So I can take a screen from any other project that I want that I have access to make sure we have the same version of IX Developer, but I can import these screens in so I don't have to recreate them.
Hey, Gabe, we have a question coming, and I think you may be answering it here, but the question asks, can you share a template with other designers at a company in a shared location? And I guess if it's a shared folder, you can, is that correct?
So if you give them access to that project, they can pull that in. They can import it the same, but it wouldn't be go to, I guess you could. Yeah, I think you could. You'd have to have access to that folder. So if this was sitting outside of, say, its own shared folder, like on a network drive, you should be able to grab this and import it in.
Okay, thanks.
So they wouldn't have to use the entire project. Okay, so we have, let's see, let's go back. All right, so we did the imports. We've gone over the templates, which we can include the pop-up windows. And also, we have the ability to just take a screen and actually copy and paste it, the entire thing. So if you have to redo the same screen over and just change tags, if you copy and paste an actual set of objects on the screen, so if you copy it here, create a new screen, it'll actually place that object in the same location of the new screen. So you don't have to worry about realigning, going in and changing the X or Y, the top or left corner values, the position of the object on that screen. All right. So a lot of ways that you can get around of having to keep recreating yourself. Now, let's go jump back to, always wants to switch on me, sorry. Let's establish a base screen, all right? Preferably the background to foreground. Now in IX Developer, you have the ability to stack background screens. So you can create one for a certain set of users, you can create one for, just a number of different scenarios. Now you can see here in the images that I have the exact same 3 buttons, but they have a different background. Look how much easier it is to read some of those buttons compared to a lighter or a darker background. And there's just buttons. You can see where the color stops, the edge of the buttons and the borders are, right? But you can also see that dark blue doesn't really look good on the black. Not from aesthetic standpoint, but just the readability. If somebody's eyesight is a little poor, maybe it's in the lighting in the room where the panel is, it might not be clearly visible. All right. Keep the background simple and clean. You're going to keep all of your interactive objects on the foreground. All right. So on the main page, the child page, because the background would be the parent, you're going to keep all your interactivity on that page, because your different screens will actually, the positions of objects where things are could cover other objects on your background screen. All right, so if you have a bunch of interaction, say dynamics of moving, of motion, blinking, there could be something that moving on your background screen that's going to get overlooked because it's covered by one specific screen. Now, with the interactivity of objects, there's a lot of things to consider. All right, when do you use which type of object? So you see here a couple different examples. In the upper right-hand corner, you can see that I'm using an analog numeric with the string data type, or I can see a full keyboard that takes up literally the entire screen. All right, well, the bottom half anyways. Now, if you look over to the right of it, we have a drop-down, Fahrenheit, right? But if you look at the bottom image, instead of using a keyboard, we're using the selectable drop-down object with predefined values. Now, it does a few different things for us. It enables us to reduce the amount of errors, typos, or anything else. I mean, obviously, depending on where these values are being sent to. So we remove user error, and we can also save ourselves some real estate on the screen. Say the screen has a bunch of objects, and based off of the values or the position of those objects, we're going to have to type in, or we'll have to select a value from either the analog numeric or the dropdown. If those objects are covered, say you're just having one of those days, it's going to be, we have to keep exiting out of the keyboard and going back to it because you're just being distracted or whatever it is. It doesn't provide the best user experience. All right, so knowing when to use which, and if you have the ability to, like if you have the creative freedom to be able to select it differently, by all means. So examine the other objects. Just because you're used to typing it in, or that's how the previous project was, doesn't mean that it has to be that way. You know, unfortunately, sometimes we might be under those constraints and it needs to work exactly the same way that it did when you got the project, all right? Now, text size is another thing. The text size on an object, the text size of just being a text object on the screen can actually alter everything, because it's very seldom that you're going to have a screen without any type of text on it. Now, it can be all images with valves or whatnot, but you're going to identify some way of which is which. Okay, so moving on to text, well, just further expanding on the text objects, there's a lot of things to consider, which is going to be things like the weight of the text, the font family, the font size, and so on. Now, we're going to look into that deeper here shortly, but we're going to move on to screen content. Now, the screen content. You can condense it where you're just throwing 100 objects on the screen and they're all stacked on top of each other. So it makes it a little bit more difficult to understand what's actually happening on the page, whether you're editing the right object or not, whether you're clicking the right toggle, and so on. Now, obviously, that in your design process, you'll be able to see that, hey, guess what? This is a lot of information on this page. Could I split it to 2 different pages? How do I classify the information, how it's grouped? So that's stuff you'll come up with your design, in the design phase of building out your HMI, designing your HMI.
Hey, Gabe, I have a question here too. I think it's maybe relative to the prior screen, but the question asks, can you limit the type of data that you're inserting if you only want numbers or you only want words, characters?
Yes, you can. It's a pretty open question. So depending on what type of object it's going to be, you can, like our analog numerics, if you put in a decimal, if you put in even the range of numbers, you can set a minimum or a maximum. And so everything that the user inputs, you can limit to that. All right, but keep in mind though, if you're using a string, it's going to take numbers as characters of a string. Or if you set it to a numerical value, like a decimal or something, it won't allow letters.
Okay,
the keyboards will also change in doing so. And I can show an example of that as soon as we get back into IX Developer. Okay, so what I'm saying here is that how many objects you have that you're interacting with, tag size, and all this being condensed, how you organize those screens could affect your entire project, because going back through and saying, oh, that's too much, I need to add a screen, but there needs to be multiple ways to navigate to that screen. Could cause a lot of confusion. Now, if you're documenting this, that's a lot of documentation to update of what screen jumps to what screen, whether you're typing it out or you're showing graphical representation. But again, nobody likes to deal with documentation, but it's there for a reason. So you'd save yourself a lot of time by designing it out front, sketching out those screens, going, okay, I have 60 different analog numerics I need to throw on the screen. How can I group these and put them so they're not all sitting on top of each other? And if I need, like, say, a multi-picture object, like these rocker switches here, these toggle switches, if somebody's using the screen, say a 5-inch screen or a 7-inch screen with gloves on, they're tapping the screen, are they going to hit the right one? Are they turning on and off? Are they get frustrated because they're tapping one and they're not moving their hand over, trying to figure out why it's not working? Again, HMI is going to be all based off of the HMI project, obviously with the connection to the controller and everything that it's doing, but it's the human piece of it that we're developing, that user experience, right? So we need to think about who's our audience. Now, on the screen content, if you have an object that you have dynamics to, does it need to represent? Does that object need to represent multiple different ways of the same value? All right, so you can see here that I have an object that has a move, a size, and a visibility dynamic all associated. Some of these are going to be redundant.
Hey, Gabe, we have another question about some of these design concepts. The question asks, is there some international standard concerning HMI designs or some guidelines that can help in this area?
Yes, there is. And what I can do is I actually have a standard, the ASI standard is where I got the majority of this information from, but there has been a number of different books with everyone setting their own standards with it as well, they all kind of fall in line from the research I've done. They all kind of fall in line with each other, but just written differently. So obviously the newer ones are going to be more user experience based, as opposed to just a generic over brand of it needs to be this size with this size screen, like a strict number. Say this button needs to be 25 pixels high and 40 pixels wide on a 7-inch screen, but then double that for a 10-inch screen or whatever. So they can be a little bit more loosely identified. I guess the standards are a little bit more loosely defined, but just kind of the concept as opposed to before when it's just specific.
Okay, thanks.
And I believe it's an ASI 101.1 standards is the one that I use. Okay. Now, you can see we were just talking about the dynamics, the number of dynamics on an object on the screen. But what about multiple objects, all with dynamics, let's say moving or resizing? All right, so obviously you're going to have, is it worth moving the object if it's just moving an inch or say 50 pixels when you have 60 to 100 objects just moving a pixel? Is there another way that you can represent that? Maybe use a linear meter and change the value to show that way so you don't have objects overlapping each other. Maybe resizing it. Again, you're just going to take up more real estate of the screen to make it look a little bit more crowded and could be very overwhelming for some users. Now, let's get into our typography. All right, so the typography. You can see here that we have a couple different visuals here to show you the exact same text and how it can appear based off of different background colors. All right, and we have different weights. So they're all Tahoma style fonts. One's bold, one isn't, and placing that same text color, a foreground color on a background can make a huge difference. So obviously we're looking for something that's going to be, everyone's different, we're looking for something that's going to be more consistent for everybody. All right, for the general user. All right, so a lot of times, again, you're not going to have the creativity, freedom, the creative freedom that you'd like to have with your projects. You could be restricted to the company colors, your font types that are approved, how big the font is, and so on. But all those things under the to consider list are all things that can obviously change an entire theme and feel of your project. All right. Now, you notice there on the font weight, like the bold on that black, sorry, the black font on bolded on the blue background, it's much tougher for me to read. All right, obviously the black on the white shows a great set of contrast. So it makes it a little bit easier to read. Now here's something you might not have thought about, but something that's actually, it was pretty interesting when I was doing my research on it. All right, so accessibility, it's a huge thing, right? It is web development and so on, but the differences of what people will see if they're colorblind. Now put that in consideration to your company colors, your approved colors, and so on that you're applying to your project, something that you typically like. All right, so anomaly is the sensitivity to red light. And you can compare that to what the original color is. All right, the deuteranomaly is the sensitivity to green light. Now just look at that for a second and see how great of a difference these colors really are. All right, and that last one there, tritonality, is the reduction of sensitivity to blue light, which is apparently very rare. So how would you design your system if your documentation, if your training says when the text turns red and they can't see red? And we're not always using a traffic light type scenario where that middle light is always going to be yellow, so you know to slow down. If somebody doesn't know they're colorblind, and if you didn't know you were colorblind before we got to this slide and you just found out, I'm terribly sorry. I'm the one to break the news to you. All right. All right, now here's a lot of great rules around resizing moving and flashing objects. Too many objects flashing and blinking can just cause distraction, especially on the smaller screens. Keep it to a minimum. Have them displayed, make them distinctive, but keep the actual movement to a minimum. Things like images, great for motion. Or probably should avoid strings of text rolling. So you can see there in the example where it says alarm 1 has been triggered to resolve, and then if that was scrolling text, you can have a list of instructions. What happens if somebody doesn't get to it till you're in instruction 4, step 4? They have to wait for it to come all the way back down to start over so they can see what the first step is. How critical is the alarm? That would cause a big problem, right? Now, something like danger alert, like the top text, something like that flashing could be a completely different thing, right? But again, if something's flashing or just blinking, and so you have text that scrolls somewhere else, and there's the inconsistency. I'm probably going to stand there and look at that danger alert flashing longer than I should because I'm expecting something else to display. So keeping things consistent, obviously, is huge. That goes with writing your code, that goes with taking your notes. So there's a theme, there's a pattern to follow. So if something can be misconstrued, then you have something to fall back on. Okay, they meant this every other time it's been clear. I can assume that it's going to be the same type of deal, as opposed to I have no idea what he meant. Whatever, move on, and they change something, break something, and so on. Obviously, that was an extreme for an example, but you get the idea. And again, like I mentioned before, if you have same object moving and you have the value shown, why would you need a second motion, a second dynamic applied to that object to display the same exact thing? Now I'm going to jump out of PowerPoint for a second, and I'm going to show you. I'm going to run this project. You can see here that I have this tank, the meter, floating up. It's moving up. But yet I still have the same linear meter in here showing that the value is increasing. I mean, first off, it doesn't really make much sense why this is set up this way. But for the overall illustration purpose of this demonstration, you get the idea. Two different motions, two different dynamics, displaying the same exact thing. Overkill, right? That is what I meant when I said avoid excessive moving. Avoid the excessive dynamics that can be applied to an object. Okay. Now, project consistency. There are a lot of different ways that you can use you can be consistent within your projects. Now, we went over a couple of them by using a base project, by creating template screens, by setting up a style guide. All right, but do yourself some other favors, such as, sorry, I'm going to jump right back out. Well, before I do that, I can show you here that you can split your screens. So if there's something that you're constantly using, a screen that you're always making reference to, put a version of that screen, put an instance of that screen up next to it so you always can go back and forth. All right. Use the component library to to keep track of revisions and your style guides themselves. So, jumping back out. You can see here that I have on the left-hand side under my script modules, I use as basically a notepad. So my revision notes. So I just took out all the script and I just commented out so there wasn't any errors when I tried to compile my project. And I did that just with a multi-line comment syntax, and that's just a slash with a star, and then a star. The ending tag is going to be a star with a slash. All right, so everything in between is going to be green, and you can place whatever it's going to be in there. Keep a revision number. Keep a version so you know what's deployed and what isn't. All right, just another way to document so there's not a question, which always comes up, is how do I get this project off? I'm not sure if it's off this panel. I'm not sure if this is the most recent project. Keep notes. Set your task list in here. And then say, create another entry saying, okay, task 1 from date so-and-so or whenever has been completed. Task 1 has been completed. Here's what was changed. Here's what was altered, so on. So keep track of this stuff. All right, it's not going to show up anywhere else until you're in IX Developer. So if they don't have access to opening the project in IX Developer, no one's going to see it but you. All right. Now, that's just adding, doing insert, and going to our script module. If I add another one, I would just do, and before I clear it out, you can see that single line comments are just slash slash. So I can take all of this, do a star slash, oops. And everything I place, all my notes and text, I can keep in there, all right? Now, another way to do it is to apply, say, a revision number to your tags. So I can say, name a tag revision number, and go to the initial value, version 15. Now, if I want, I can apply that tag to a text object and place it on the home screen, the landing page, or something like like an admin screen or a version or an about page screen of what's been deployed. All right, but this is the one that you have to keep updating. As long as, I mean, for both of them, you have to keep updating, but to reflect the proper one, once it's been updated, you come back here and change that so it reflects when the project is running. Now, the style guide. Say this is a style guide that you're going to use multiple places, multiple projects. Now, this is something that's stored in the component library. So if I come here, I created a category. So if I right click on component library, I can do add category. And I went through and I renamed it to style guide. You can see here that all I need to do is, here's a style guide I created. I can copy that and paste it in here, and I automatically get another text file. All right, I can rename it to what it is, and this saves within my instance of developer. So every project I open up, I have them labeled appropriately. I can say, oh, all right, this is the style I need to use. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to grab, say, let's see, I'm going to take my dynamic screen, and I want to be able to see my style guide of what objects I'm going to use. So I'm just going to take my cursor here, grab the tab, and I get this navigation property location here, right? And so I'm just going to take the split on the right side, just going to readjust my screen. Real estate. And so when I actually use my property grid, I can see what should the style be. And I can make my changes based off of what I see here. So I don't have to keep flipping back between tabs. Help keep consistency, save yourself some work of flipping back and forth between screens, and use our favorites in the property grid. So when you select a certain object, you set your favorites. Every time you select that object or use that object throughout your project, you're going to have the same options up here. And it's super easy to configure what options you're going to see by clicking on the star. So there's a little arrow off to the right-hand side. I'm not sure if you can see it. And you can decide on what objects you're moving your favorites. Keep things consistent. Make things easier for yourself and plan and document your HMI project to make things easier for future use. So the initial one is always, the initial set of documentation is always the most painful, but it will be beneficial. Sorry about that. And let me jump to our last screen. Some tricks, any questions, any additional questions? Something you want to see again?
So any final questions? You could just enter them in the chat if you do, and Gabe would be happy to answer them. Just give it a minute, and then looks like you answered everybody's questions on that in terms of tips and tricks, Gabe. So that was terrific. This webinar, like the others, is being recorded, and we will store it. I think in particular, this one will probably be a really good reference. There was a lot covered that you can go back and remind yourself of in terms of best practice when you're putting a project together. Just to mention, if you can join us again in 2 weeks' time, and at that time we'll be having a discussion on how you can use MQTT, which is the main standard for connecting to all the popular cloud solutions out there, and also Acero Plus, which is our own cloud solution as well. So that will be on June 23rd. And please, if you could join us again, that'll be a very interesting session. I think we have one last question before we wrap up, Gabe. Somebody mentions in the chat that they're using a lot of double integers, and they always default to integer 32. Is there a way to make it default to real instead of integer? I want to field that last question.
So hopefully everyone can still see my screen.
Yep.
Let's see here. I'll just go to analog numeric. So if we were just to throw an analog numeric on the screen, we can do something like displaying as a decimal, right? Because we're going to need to see some decimal values. And if we come to our tags, so if we were to associate our tag with it, say tag 1, we have options for how it's displayed. So what we could do is we can come here to our object data type, and we can do floats, doubles. Yeah, so we do have the uint and an int32, if that helps. But in our controller, we can select a float as a data type for it to come in. Now, going back to our controller there, our analog numeric, we can make things like, we can limit the characters, or we can limit the number of decimals. All right, so if we want to throw 10 on the end of that, Contents. Makes sense. We can split it up so we can get a more accurate value being displayed. That makes sense.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that. And just so people know, Gabe is on staff here at Beijer Electronics, and a big part of his role is working with our customers on any tricky applications or consulting with them on projects. So he is available as well after this webinar. If you're a Beijer customer and need help, then feel free to reach out. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody for their time and wish them a great day and a safe week. Thank you, everybody.